So given that we're all here to talk about history, you might wonder a little bit about the title of this talk, which is Finding Truth in the Age of Fake News, or what does fake news, which is all about what's happening or not happening now, have to do with history. So we're going to take a little bit of time tonight to establish some basics about studying history and how that affects the way that we look at the world around us. So tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I sincerely hope that you'll be here. We're going to dig a little deeper into some more technical aspects of doing history, the different schools of history, how they developed from ancient times up to the present, how all of those schools are still with us. And then on Wednesday morning, I believe I have that right, we're going to talk about what happens when we adopt one particular school, teach from it, and everybody gets mad at us and demands why we didn't pick one of the other schools. So those will be a little bit more technical. We want to be a little bit more big picture tonight, and we want to talk about the part that history plays, and you're just going to have to forgive me because I do have a couple of YouTube videos to play, and I haven't done, okay, good. I think we're in good shape. So I want to just start with one of my favorite quotes, and this is actually from the first edition of The Well-Trained Mind, which was 1999. This is an old quote. It's from 1997, when the documentary filmmaker Ken Burns appeared at the National Press Club, and a reporter said, "Mr. Burns, most high school graduates see no purpose in studying history. What do you say to that?" And Ken Burns said, and this is not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase, "History is the study of everything that has happened until this present moment," right? Everything before right now is history. So unless you plan to live entirely in the present moment, the study of history is inescapable. Fake news, fake history, trustworthy news, true history, these are the same things. They're just separated by a slightly different interval in time. So I want to see if we can just jump directly into the fire here.
This morning, the New York Times says Donald Trump went too far, but Trump wants an apology. The Republican presidential frontrunner rejects charges that he insulted a Times reporter by imitating his disability. The reporter says the candidate's explanation does not surprise him. Nancy Cordes is in Washington with the latest Trump controversy. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning. Trump claims that he didn't mean to mock the reporter and that he never met him. The reporter says that's not remotely true. Still, Trump is not backing down. He will not apologize, and even said that the journalist should stop using his disability to grandstand.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
That, quote, nice reporter is Serge Kovaleski, who suffers from a physical disability that limits the movement of his arms. Kovaleski wrote the original article in the Washington Post, published a week after 9/11, which describes a number of people who were allegedly seen celebrating the attacks. Trump has used that paragraph as proof of what he saw.
On rooftops, while they watched the devastation on the other side of the river.
But Kovaleski recently told CNN he doesn't recall anyone saying there were thousands or even hundreds of people celebrating.
He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. This is 14 years ago. They didn't do a retraction.
Kovaleski is now an investigative reporter for the New York Times, which said it is outraged by Trump's comments. In response, Trump released a statement Thursday saying, "Despite having one of the all-time great memories, I certainly do not remember him," and that he merely mimicked what he imagined would be a flustered reporter trying to get out of a statement he made long ago. But Kovaleski has a long history with Trump, starting in 1987 when he covered the real estate mogul for the New York Daily News. Kovaleski told the Washington Post, "It didn't in the slightest bit jar or surprise me that Donald Trump would do something this low rent, given his track record." Trump has demanded an apology from the New York Times and said that if he had known Kovaleski was disabled, he, quote, would definitely not say anything about his appearance. But Kovaleski spoke to a fellow Times reporter yesterday and told them that he and Trump were on a first-name basis for years, Don.
All right, Nancy, thank you very much.
All right, so many directions we could go from here. So that was November 2015, right? So definitely history at this point, right? but still also very present. So it was barely a month ago, I was actually feeding sheep and listening to Morning Edition on my iPod. And NPR's reporter David Green was in Iowa right before those ill-fated caucuses. And he was interviewing Madison County Supervisor Diane Fitch and a telecom engineer named Heather Stansel about Nancy Pelosi ripping up Trump's State of the Union speech. So that's the context for this, and here was a bit of the dialogue. He says, and remember that this is the interview was actually very easy to listen to, and everyone sounded very literate. Everyone sounds like an idiot when their words are transposed for, a transcript like this. So Green says, Nancy Pelosi crossed a line, you're saying, by ripping up the speech. Stansel says, absolutely. Green, let me ask you where your line is with Trump. A few years ago, he made fun of a physically disabled reporter, and immediately both of these voters jump in. Fitch says, that was taken out of. Stansel says, that was fake news. Fitch says, that's fake news. It makes us angry when I can see the context. How is this spreading? How can this be? How can this happen? Green says it's two different realities. To people who criticize the president, it's pretty clear that he was mocking him, but you, and Stansel says, why is that so offensive to you? Why are you so morally outraged for someone else? Now, this exchange is something that I want us to hold in mind as we talk about how we understand the past. Because I feel like that if we can get a better grip on what history is, how to accept or question it, and why, it's going to be a lot simpler for us to understand and respond to this sort of interchange, and this is what is happening in our country every single day, all of the time. What we have to be able to do is to understand why these exchanges happen. So we're going to take a little time to talk about history, and then we're going to come back to this particular bit of news, fake or otherwise, at the end of the talk and see if we've gathered any insight about it. So here's where we want to start. We're going to start in a very basic place. Let's just start out by defining history. So if you go to the dictionary, which is always where my freshmen start when I ask them to write a paper, Webster's defines this as, we're going to find three definitions. History is the study of past events, particularly in human affairs. History is the whole series of past events connected with someone or something. History is a continuous, typically chronological record of important or public events. Now, when people say, I hate history, which so many people do, it's because when they're thinking of history, they're thinking of two or three. They're thinking of a series of events that can be documented, that can be demonstrated to be not fake, that can be shown to be true, to have really happened. The problem is that that's not history, that's chronology. History is number one. History is the study of past human affairs, and that always has to involve explanation. So my favorite definition of history is John Arnold. He says, history is above all an argument. It's an argument between different historians. Arguments are important because they create the possibility of changing things. We're going to come back to this quote also in a minute. But let me give you an example of a point of view in history, and this is intentionally from an elementary text, because those are the ones we think of perhaps as having least point of view. This is from a classic. This is from Hendrik van Loon, The Story of Mankind, lovely narrative text about past times. Here he is about the Phoenicians. They bought and sold whatever promised to bring them a good profit. They were not troubled by a conscience. If we are to believe all their neighbors, they did not know what the words honesty or integrity meant. They regarded a well-filled treasure chest the highest ideal of all good citizens. Indeed, they were very unpleasant people and did not have a single friend. Nevertheless, they have rendered all coming generations one service of the greatest possible value. They gave us our alphabet. The Phoenicians had been familiar with the art of writing invented by the Sumerians, but they regarded these pothooks as a clumsy waste of time. They were practical businessmen and could not spend hours engraving 2 or 3 letters. They set to work and invented a new system of writing, which was greatly superior to the old one. They borrowed a few pictures from the Egyptians, and they simplified a number of the wedge-shaped figures of the Sumerians. They sacrificed the pretty looks of the older system for the advantages of speed, and they reduced the thousands of different images to a short and handy alphabet of 22 letters. Now, this is not a factually inaccurate account of the beginnings of the alphabet. pretty much everything that he describes as having happened actually happened. But there is an argument behind this that has absolutely nothing to do with the alphabet. And it's an argument not even about the Phoenicians in particular, although he's not very nice to them. The argument is that there is such a thing as a racial character, right? They were all very unpleasant people and did not have a single friend. The French are snooty, British are drunks, Americans are rude, okay? So even without a single declarative sentence being stated, students are absorbing this idea that there is such a thing as a racial character. And this, indeed, is not a neutral thing. In fact, it's pretty disturbing if you want to skip forward a century and look at, for example, among many others that we could pick, Wade Hampton's 1890 essay, The Race Problem, which was based on the work of the very best contemporary historians and informed a great deal of early 20th century historians as they worked on race relations. The white and black races are essentially different, not only in physical organization, but in mental characteristic. This assertion is not made by way of reproach, nor does it apply to those of the race in this country who have proved their capacity to be numbered among the valuable, who deserve all praise for their successful struggle against adverse fortune and hard fate, by which he means their racial character. You'll notice that in this passage, which follows directly on Van Loon's assumption that there is such a thing as a racial character, that the individual exceptions of self-governing black citizens does not change his basic historical assumption, which is that all will eventually go down before the masterful, conquering, and unconquerable Caucasians. So these sorts of assumptions in historical writing are inevitable, and they are not benign. They are important. And one of the things we're going to do tomorrow morning, and I hope you'll be here, is talk about whole categories of historical argument and how they developed. But what we want to do is taking this as the assumption that historical narratives are all going to have some sort of argument that they're making, even if it is not explicitly stated. We want to talk about how those arguments are formed and how those arguments emerge from the histories that we read. And if you are a historian, you're going to find some of this very basic. But I have to say that as a historian myself, I find it incredibly useful to continue to remind myself of the basics. So let's start here with history essentials. When we're writing history, or reading it, we can think about history as having two parts. First of all, there's the evidence. So history is, in large part, the investigation of past events. So a big part of history is the evidence left behind for those who lived long or not so long ago. So papers of all kinds, invoices, bills, receipts, diaries, letters. How do we know how, for example, you have to excuse me, I have lots of examples from the South because I teach in Virginia. How do we know how the Southern plantation economy worked? Because we've got paperwork recording sales of slaves, purchase of supplies, prices paid for crops. A big part of the evidence that we have to construct a story about how this economy worked. Physical traces are also vital. Go a little further back. How do we know how far the Romans progressed into Britain? Because we can see their camps. We can see the remains of Roman roads and walls crumbling beneath the grass. All of these are primary sources. But I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on primary sources because primary sources are not what history does, any more than flour and sugar and butter are a cake. Those are just the raw materials. The task of the historian isn't just to tell you what happened, but to explain why, all right? Not just to construct an outline of facts, but to tell a story about them. Now, I know that sounds really basic, but consider there are two major complications with this enterprise. And the first is this distinction that we were all taught in high school, or if you didn't study history properly in high school, maybe you learned it in your freshman history seminar in college, between primary and secondary sources. So a primary source is something, produced by people of the time, and a secondary source is what somebody else says about that primary source. And we're all taught that primary sources are more reliable. Well, no, not really. A historian never sits down with a collection of documents or artifacts with a fresh mind, Her mind is already full of other people's theories as to why Rome fell or how African Americans in slavery developed a culture of their own. So as soon as she comes up against the primary source, she's already asking, what theories do I already know? How do they explain this source? Can I come up with a better interpretation? We never come directly to a primary source. We've already got stories floating around in our heads. That's the first complication. And then second, I think history reveals to us, more than I think any other scholarly enterprise, how intertwined the ideas of telling a story and making an argument are. And this, again, is probably one of those distinctions that we all learned at some point. It goes that proving something with evidence is different from telling a story, creating a narrative. And it's a distinction that goes back at least to Plato. So an argument is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. A story, on the other hand, has characters and a setting and a beginning and a middle and an end. And you've probably all seen the classic arc here. A story begins when you have a character. That's the exposition part there. Here's the character. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. That's the exposition. The character runs into an obstacle or a block or a problem. Okay, that's the conflict. The character has a ring, and then Gandalf shows up. The character has to make a plan to deal with the obstacle or the block. I will go to Mordor, although I do not know the way, right? So the character's plan to deal with the problem is what creates this rising action that goes all the way up to the climax, which may come sooner or it may come after 3 volumes and hundreds of thousands of words later, where the ring goes into the fire. Okay, that's the climax. The character either triumphs or fails, or possibly both simultaneously, and everything changes, and there's this resolution, this falling action, and the character ends up in a different place than at the beginning. That's the resolution. One of the advantages to doing a doctorate in American studies, well, I mean, the disadvantage is that everyone in the literature department says that you don't really do literature, and everyone in the history department says you don't really know how to do history. But apart from that, is that you do both literature and history. And so you can see the commonalities. You should recognize this as the classic analysis of a novel. And sometimes it's a little more complicated, so this is actually, I kind of like this one. Here's another one. There can be peaks, right? So, awful life, evil sisters, gets ball invite, makes clothes, go to the balls, dance with the prince. Oh no, have to go back to the same awful life as before. But notice it's not quite as low because things are a little better now. Back up to the prince finds her and they live happily ever after. So you can have a series of peaks and valleys, but generally speaking, this is the structure of a novel. The thing is that this is the same structure that a historian uses. It's the same structure that a historian has to use. Because if we go back to our history essentials here, look at the argument and look at the story. Here's the major difference between a story and an argument. Stories take place in time and space. Arguments are atemporal and, sorry, that should say aspatial. Arguments take place outside of time and outside of space. It doesn't matter where or when you argue that Socrates is mortal, it's still going to be true. So I hope that you can immediately see the problem for historians, because historians are writing about people, and people are neither atemporal or aspatial. People exist in both time and space, and people, because we are mortal, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Add to that the fact that our brains are programmed to look for stories. It is either a mark of the divine or a evolutionary survival strategy, depending on your point of view. You can make the argument from either direction. We grasp onto stories as a way of predicting what's going to happen next, and predicting what happens next keeps us alive. Right? This is called a theory of the mind, and if you're interested in this, Alex Rosenberg recently did an excerpt, and this is actually sort of a condensation and excerpt from his book, How History Gets Things Wrong, The Neuroscience of Our Addiction to Stories. And he says, the theory of the mind tells us that, I'm going to paraphrase, behavior is about desires and beliefs. Desires are about the way we want things to turn out in the future, and belief is about the way things are now. And what we believe as human beings and as historians is that we can find meaning in what people do by finding the beliefs and desires that underlie what they do. For example, says Alex here, you see someone heading to an ice cream stand and you explain it by telling yourself a story in which the person's belief about where she can get ice cream pairs up with her wanting to have some. Alex Rosenberg's an interesting guy. I mean, he doesn't believe that people have any part of them which is not purely physical. So every single thing anyone ever does, including wanting ice cream, he's going to interpret as a function of the brain that he can chart. But he's absolutely right that when we write about the past, we're going to look for a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that beginning, middle, and end are going to involve something that somebody wants, a problem that they need to overcome, and their victory or loss in actually finding it. You know, even Plato, it's interesting, even Plato, when he is introducing the framework of this argument, which he almost invented, does so through dramatic dialogues. So even as he is giving you a logical argument, he's doing so with a plot. There's a character who needs to be convinced. There's a character who's going to convince them. There's a struggle with the argument. They're either going to accept or reject the argument, and then there's going to be this falling action where things either change or don't change. So all of this means that there is no such thing as a pure historical argument. There is always a story. So in many ways, a history is pretty much like a novel. So as we start talking about history here at the beginning of this week, and we're going to come back to this tomorrow and then the next day as well, histories tell a story about a hero. Now, this hero could be an individual, which you get in biographical history, but sometimes the hero, the main character, is a country, or perhaps a particular group within the country. So working women, soldiers, slaves. So like the hero of a novel, this historical hero is going to be grappling with a problem, and the problem might be poor wages, the demands of war, systematic discrimination, and is going to look for a strategy for coping with it. The conclusion of the history, like the climax of a novel, is going to tell us whether or not the historical hero wins or loses, or perhaps both. And it's going to pronounce a final judgment on the hero's choice of strategy and explain how things have changed. Not to oversimplify, obviously historians and novelists are not pursuing exactly the same goals, right? Because unlike novelists, historians have to shape their plots around certain givens. So this morning, very simplistic example, I walked down and had breakfast at Jobat's, and it was really, really good. This was so decadent, I had chicken fried pork belly. Right, so good, still thinking about it. So somebody who's writing a novel about Virginia sheep farmers who visit Phoenix could make me go have breakfast somewhere else. But if someone is writing a history about Virginia sheep farmers who visit Phoenix, they can't make me go somewhere else because that's where I went. They've still got to say that I went to Joe Bott's and had chicken fried pork belly. But here's what they can do. They can tell why. Why did I go down there and do that? They could say, after 2 flights and a night in a hermetically sealed hotel room, I really wanted to be outside. They could say, I have work to do, and I usually do it better if there's some level of ambient noise that I don't have to pay attention to. They could say, I did it because I raise pigs. You didn't see that video, did you, Rob? Okay, I'll send you that one. And so I'm always interested in how people cook pork. They could say that I just had a crazy desire to gain 10 pounds in a single sitting. And none of those would be wrong, obviously, but they'd fit into very different stories about me and my visit to Phoenix. So this is where we get into difficulties when we talk about history and when others talk about history to us, because generally we're not very careful to distinguish between the story and the events. We may praise a history as true, or we may condemn it as biased and inaccurate, when what we really mean is we disagree with the story. And that is not quite the same thing. So if we're ever going to get our arms around what fake news is, we're going to have to do better with history. And so let's use a few insights from classical education, take 15 minutes or so, and talk about how we can read history better so that we can stop using the words good or bad, accurate or inaccurate, true or false, and instead be able to say what the story is and whether or not we agree with it and why. So we're going to use some insights from classical education, which says, among other things, that learning tends to fall into 3 phases, and I'm going to assume you're all more or less familiar with this. Okay, good. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We use these as developmental stages for secondary students, right? So grammar, you're going to establish the basics of a subject. Logic, you're going to be able to begin to analyze those facts and think critically about them. And then rhetoric, you're going to be able to form an informed opinion about them. Just remember that not only are these stages that we use as we teach our students, but they're also the steps that we go through as adults every single time we learn something new, all right? So as part of raising sheep, we also produce wool, and we do a lot of knitting classes. So if you learn how to knit, you go through these exact 3 stages. Grammar, you learn what the stitches are. Logic, you learn how to fit them together. Rhetoric, you make something. You make a pattern. So every time you learn something new as an adult, you go through these 3 stages. And these are the stages that we should go through whenever we evaluate a work of history or a political candidate's proposal or really any piece of writing. But let's focus in on history just for a minute. So what is the grammar stage when we encounter a work of history? Well, let me suggest that there are 5 questions that we ask the first time we encounter a history. And the first one is, this is the most basic ever, and it's amazing how often we don't look for this. Does the writer state his or her purpose for writing? Mostly people do, okay? So, let's go from, I'm going to give you 2 examples, and one is from the Venerable Bede, right? His ecclesiastical history. Here's how he begins. It's in the introduction. Usually this is in the introduction. Should history tell of good men and their good estate, the thoughtful listener is spurred on to imitate the good. Should it record the evil ends of wicked men, the devout and earnest listener and reader is kindled to eschew what is harmful and perverse, and with greater care pursue those things which he has learned to be good and pleasing in the sight of God. Okay, so there you have it. He is going to tell you in this history that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, so you can be pretty sure what his story is not going to include, right? This is good to know at the beginning of your reading. Skip forward 2,000 years or so. This is from Larry Schweikart and Michael Allen's A Patriot's History of the United States. This is the first 4 sentences of the introduction. Is America's past a tale of racism, sexism, and bigotry? Is it the story of the conquest and rape of a continent? Is U.S. history the story of white slave owners who perverted the electoral process for their own interests? Did America start with Columbus killing all the Indians, leap to Jim Crow laws, and Rockefeller crushing the workers, and then finally save itself with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal? The answers, of course, are no, 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 and no. Now you know. Okay. So that's the first thing. That's your grammar stage. Read the introduction. And if you can't find the writer's purpose in the introduction, look at the last 3 pages. It's going to be in one or the other of those, right? That's your grammar stage. Once you've done that, ask yourself the novelist's question. Who's the hero? Who's the central character? It's amazing how we don't ask this about histories. But every single history has got a hero. Individuals, might be a single person, a network of individuals related by blood, a group of people. They might be distinguished by nationality, by gender, by age, by class, by job. The hero might be a nation, but whoever it is, knowing who that hero is going to help you evaluate the story that's being told. So in Bede's ecclesiastical history, it's kind of an interesting one. It's very early history, obviously. The hero is actually God. Because he keeps getting his will done despite the fact that all of the stupid humans can't really figure out what he's up to. This is good to know because the history is not actually about the church. The history is about God. Puts it in a slightly different category. For Schweikart and Allen, the hero is the founding fathers. Because what he comes back to again and again is how the ideals of the founding fathers are going to triumph. In fact, the conclusion, here's the conclusion to the Patriots' history. Greatness is not handed to us because we're Americans. Rather, Americans have reached out and seized it, and we will still be great if we behave like Americans and call on those values and inspirations that infused our fathers and their fathers and their fathers before them. Right? So that's the hero. You look at something like, sorry to go in a slightly different direction, Cornelius Ryan's book about D-Day. The history is the individual soldier, primarily the American soldier. All of the stories told are about the individual soldiers. So, who's the story about? What challenge, now you've got to keep asking the novel questions when you read a history. What challenge did this hero or heroine face? So once you discovered the identity of the central characters, you say, what is the problem? What is the challenge? Sometimes the problem, the thing that introduces conflict into this story is going to be very obvious. So in Cornelius Ryan's book, it is the Nazis. That's pretty straightforward. But a lot of times it's an ideology. Eugene Genovese's Roll, Jordan, Roll, which was one of the seminal works on African American history in the 20th century, he talks about the institution of patriarchy. That is the conflict. That is the problem. That is what challenge the central characters have to overcome. Barbara Tuchman, A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, which is one of my very, very favorite history books. She's such a wonderful writer. So her hero is this quite sizable group, 14th century people. And she lists all sorts of horrible things that happened to them. So there's plague and taxes and war and robbery and half a dozen other things. But the answer to this question is right there in the title. The problem is the 14th century. It was like uniquely calamitous. That's a bit of a tough sell, by the way. But this is how we start to evaluate a history. What is the challenge? What is the author saying is the problem here? So that leads us, up until we're going to get to the climax here. And the climax, again, we're thinking in terms of the novel, is what happened to the historical hero? What happened to the historical heroine? If you were to sum up this history as if you were summarizing a novel, how would you do so? You would say, faced by the problem of whatever the challenge is, the central character did such and such. So here's an example. Mary Wollstonecraft, Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was a history of the struggles that women had faced. The conclusion she comes to is women, that's her heroine, were faced by the problem of their lack of education. That was the struggle that they had to overcome. What was her solution? What women did to overcome this challenge? They needed to think more and feel less. That was her answer. So when we start to ask these sort of novelistic questions, what challenge, what causes it, what happened, we begin to get a view of what the historical argument is, and every single good history has one. The presence of the argument is what makes it a history rather than a chronology. If you don't have this argument, you might as well just read Wikipedia, and we will all stop writing history, right? So that's the first step. If you're looking at a history and you're trying to figure out, what you think about it. Remember, we haven't actually really evaluated this yet. We're just looking for what the central argument is. And it always is going to make more sense if you're able to treat it like a novel. So that's all just identifying the story. So now you can start asking yourself the real question, which is, do I agree? Is that a convincing story? Did the historian use all that evidence, all that raw material well? Did all that flour and sugar and butter make a cake? Or is he trying to make a cake out of meat scraps and potato peels? Right? In which case, there's nothing wrong with meat scraps and potato peels. It's just they're better off going to pigs than being made into a cake. So how did the historian use the evidence? Now, this takes a little bit of detective work. So if you're reading history, you've got to find the places where the historian makes a connection between raw materials and the story, between the events and the construction of this narrative arc that we're talking about. And to find those, you've got to remember that a story is all about cause and effect. that slope up, the conflict and challenge that the hero is tackling, that is created by the hero doing this and something happened. The hero responding and then something else happening. It's all about cause and effect. So most times historians make this easy for you because we have certain twitches that we can't get rid of. So here are the things they're going to say. Because of, since, therefore, it is clear then, it follows then, it is hardly surprising that, and the more clearly it's stated, the more tenuous the evidence tends to be. So anytime they say, it is without a doubt absolutely true, you should say, yeah, no, probably not. We'll look more closely at that. So these are the things that you're going to look for to help you trace the connection between cause and effect that the historian is using to build this narrative arc. So here's an example. I'm going to talk about Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is one of the seminal works of American history. And very briefly, because you might not get as geeked out about this argument as I am, Weber's argument is that Calvinist Protestantism, particularly that brought by the Puritan settlers, is the foundation of American capitalism. Because in Calvinism, those who are saved are not brought into the kingdom of God by their own efforts, right? Because all men are helpless, and grace has to pull them into the kingdom. So there's nothing that they can do to be saved. God draws them in. But once you're inside the kingdom of God, you can show that you're inside the kingdom of God because you are going to improve. Your life is going to get better. You don't get better in order to get into the kingdom, but once you're inside the kingdom, your life gets better. So to have a productive, healthy, progressively moving forward lifestyle becomes proof that you are one of the elect. And this introduces into Calvinism this psychological insecurity, which is that you never actually know whether you're saved or not. So the only reason you can know that you might be saved is if your life keeps getting better and better and you keep working harder and doing better. You're not earning your salvation. You are just proving to yourself that you are actually saved. That makes sense? Right? That in a really, really, really bad nutshell is the argument of Max Weber and the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So what Weber says is that capitalism is the result of this strong psychological drive to work, work, work as a way of self-assurance because nobody wants to admit that they might be damned. So, hence capitalism. I put this up because the wording itself is your cue here. Here he is. This is a summation. The religious valuation of restless, continuous, systematic work in a worldly calling as the highest means of asceticism and at the same time the surest and most evident proof of rebirth and genuine faith must have been, there's one of your keys, the most powerful conceivable lever for the expansion of the spirit of capitalism. Yeah. I mean, maybe. But the more firmly he states it, all right, the more he wants to convince you of it. This is a little bit more of a micro example. I pulled this one out of my own book, The Story of the Ancient World. This is from chapter 32. The Exodus became the central event in the history of the Hebrews, the defining moment around which the entire story of the Jewish nation was structured. It shows up nowhere in Egyptian chronicles. This is hardly surprising, at which point your antennas should go up. The exodus of the Hebrew was a nose-thumbing directed not just at the power of the Pharaoh and his court, but at the power of the Egyptian gods themselves. The plagues were designed to ram home the impotence of the Egyptian pantheon, so on. These are not the kind of events that appear in the celebratory inscriptions of any pharaoh. Well, it was a good chapter. I mean, I liked this book. I'm proud of it. But the truth is, there's actually, what I don't actually say is, there is no direct historical evidence for the Exodus. But in fact, there is no direct historical evidence for the Exodus. So, therefore, it is hardly surprising that there is no historical evidence for the Exodus. Right? So, as you're reading, you just look out for these, keys. Actually, can I go backwards? Ha, there they are. Okay, So you look out for these words because these are the phrases that are going to tip you off that the historian is showing you, he's revealing the bones of what he does. He's showing you, tipping his hand, showing you what the connection is between the events and the conclusion that he wants to bring. Now, there are a few things to look out for, and I'm just going to take, there are many ways that historians try to pull the wool over your eyes as they are making their arguments, taking their butter and flour and sugar and making it into a cake, which they want to convince you tastes like ginger, even if it doesn't. So just quickly, I want to run through, 7 or 8 of the things that you might look out for. So we'll start with hasty generalizations. Okay, so here's what a hasty generalization is. Women were oppressed in ancient Greece. Women were oppressed in ancient Britain. Women were oppressed in ancient China. Women were oppressed in ancient India. Women were oppressed in ancient South America. Women were oppressed in ancient North America. Therefore, women were oppressed in every ancient civilization. Well, we don't actually know that to be the case, all right? We can actually only conclude from this that women were oppressed in these 6 ancient cultures that I just listed. So anytime you see an overall statement that has to do with the entire sweep of history during any time, you mark that and think to yourself, okay, perhaps this is something that I should examine as I decide whether or not I'm going to agree with this historian's story. The best you could do with this is, women were oppressed in the ancient cultures for which we possess historical evidence. It's not nearly as catchy, but that would not be a hasty generalization. Hand in hand with this is a failure to define terms. What does oppressed mean? Is it denied the vote, but able to hold property? Allowed to vote and hold property, but paid lower wages for doing what men do? Not allowed access to abortion? Kept in a closet and fed scraps? This word itself is just a word. It needs careful definition. So, whenever an abstract term is used, whether that's oppression or liberty or equality or freedom or any of these big words that describe the human condition, you have to ask yourself, did the historian actually define what he or she means by that? Backward reasoning. Backward reasoning takes a description and finds a cause for it. So, for example, Gibbon was very bad about this. I love Gibbon. Read the magisterial history of the Roman Empire, but he's terrible about backwards reasoning. Every empire that has relied on mercenary armies has disintegrated. Okay? That might actually be true, although it sounds like a hasty generalization to me. But if every empire that has relied on mercenary armies has disintegrated becomes empires disintegrate because they rely on mercenary armies, then we are doing backwards reasoning. Something else to look for. The same error going in the other direction is what we call a post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is literally that is after that, therefore because of it, this happened, and then this happened, therefore this happened, because this happened. It's drawing a causal connection when in fact all we can see is that there's a connection in time. So Gibbon also does this. Rome recruited its army from mercenaries. Rome fell. Therefore, the army of mercenaries called the fall of Rome. These are just the things we want to look for as we try to decide whether or not we're going to trust the historical story. Failure to highlight both similarities and differences. Whenever a historian draws parallels between events that happen in different cultures at different times, does the historian also say, and by the way, here are the things that are different about them? So for example, it's pretty easy to pick out commonalities between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And there are a lot of historians who do a very good job of telling a story of the American Revolution that parallels the French Revolution. The difference, of course, being that heads didn't fall on this side. Why is that? If the historian does not account for that, then that is not necessarily a trustworthy story. Substituting a question for a statement. Now, I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute from our fake news headline, but my favorite historical example of this is actually from Thomas Paine in Common Sense, which is a history. It's a historical analysis of the relationship between Britain and the colonies. And so Thomas Paine does this enormous survey of everything that is wrong between Britain and the colonies. And then instead of making a statement where he says, and here is why, he says, all you who speak of harmony and reconciliation, can you give us back all the time lost that is past? And then he just goes on. He just moves on. He just goes on. So anytime you see a question, you need to be really, really careful. Thomas Paine is also the master of the false analogy, because as soon as he says, can you restore to us the time that is past, he says, can you give to prostitutes their former innocence, nor can you reconcile Britain and America? At which point you should be like, what? Right? So the analogy is meant to illustrate the impossibility of reconciliation. Can you give the prostitute back her innocence? No. Can you reconcile Britain and America? No. But that's not the point. He's a very skilled rhetorician. That's not why he picked that particular analogy. As soon as he says it, he wants you to say, ooh, no, ugh, okay? He wants to produce a feeling of revulsion in you, which will stop you from thinking, well, maybe we can reconcile Britain and America. He wants to imply that there's a moral evil to reconciliation, and he does so very successfully. And then finally, as we look at these historical examples, a lot of times we're going to see an argument by example. And this is the point where I remind you that although every history is a story, telling a story is not the same thing as proving a point. And a good historian can lead you along with these stories to the point where you forget that the point hasn't actually been shown. So Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, a classic history of women in America. Her assertion is women were barred from certain intellectual pursuits in the 1950s. So here's her point, here's her assertion. Girls would not study physics, it was unfeminine. Here's her proof. A girl refused a science fellowship at Johns Hopkins to take a job in a real estate office because all she wanted, she said, was what every other American girl wanted, to get married, have 4 children, and live in a nice house in a nice suburb. And then she goes on. So, did she apply for this fellowship? Was it offered to her out of the blue, which would kind of disprove Friedan's point? Did any other girls accept these fellowships? How many? In what proportion? What are the statistics? So no matter how vivid a story is, a single example, and this goes back to our hasty generalizations, a single example does not show a systematic movement. Now, I just go over these because finding the story is only the first part. Then you've got to start asking yourself some of these questions about the way that the story is developed to ask yourself whether or not you're convinced by the story. Remember, though, we're still not using the words true and false or accurate and inaccurate. We're talking about whether or not this is the story that we find the most convincing. This is a little bit different. And then, once you've done all this work, then you can move forward to the rhetoric stage, which is after you have mastered the basic form of the history and asked yourself questions about it, you ask yourself, what does the historian want me to do or be convinced of? What is the point of this history? Does the historian want me to do something, to believe something? What is it? In this history, what is the historian's explanation for why things went wrong, for why the original conflict erupted? Because the explanation for why the original conflict with the historical hero or heroine arrived will show you something about what that historian thinks about the human race. Was it evil? Was it greed? Was it rebellion against God? Was it human nature? What was the reason? And then finally, you have to ask yourself, given the same facts, would you have told the same story? Would you have come to that similar conclusion? Would you, in fact, have picked this hero or heroine, told this story, and found the same result? So this is just an introduction to how we need to think about historical writing. And let me try then to connect this back to fake news. So let's go back to Mr. Trump and CNN. Okay, so here he is. I'm just going to play just the very first part of this again. And then I'm going to try to go just to remind you.
Times says Donald Trump went too far.
We're not
but
gonna go through the whole
Trump wants
thing.
an apology. The Republican presidential frontrunner rejects charges that he insulted a Times reporter by imitating his disability. The reporter says the candidate's explanation does not surprise him. Nancy Cordes is in Washington with the latest Trump controversy. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning. Trump claims that he didn't mean to mock the reporter and that he never met him. The reporter says that's not remotely true. Still, Trump is not backing down. He will not apologize and even said that the journalist should stop using his disability to grandstand.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
That, quote, nice
Okay.
reporter is Serge Kovaleski, who's
All right, I'm going to see now. Okay, now, this is a Fox News compilation of Trump mocking a whole bunch of different people. It's not that hard to find. From a year later. Oh,
Those
sorry,
prices are
wait,
good
can
for
I
today
skip the
only.
ad?
There's a lot of flexibility here. We can work something out if bring the price down.
And we'll
Okay.
get some of these regulators out of the banks so you can borrow and you can help. Because, you know, the banks now, they can't do anything. They're run by the regulators. In all fairness to the banks, they're run by the regulators. When you see the president of the bank, I mentioned the word regulator, these guys come in, they run the banks. And I watched a general recently on television, and they said to him, what do you think about ISIS? Oh, ISIS is very tough. And I'm saying, first of all, why is a general on television? I don't want my generals on television. I heard Ted's a good debater. I said, he is a good debater, but he can't talk, okay? Bad talker. He's a good debater, bad talker. So he's over here. They asked him about waterboarding. They said, Senator Cruz, what do you think of waterboarding? Oh, I don't want to talk about it. You know, he didn't want to talk about waterboarding because too controversial. And I'm saying to myself, they're chopping off heads. He doesn't want to talk about waterboarding. A couple of good paragraphs. And talking about northern New Jersey draws the prober's eye. Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember.
Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, so this is sort of, let's start with the rhetoric question and go backwards. Is there another possible explanation? That's what Fox wants you to know. There's another possible explanation for this. Okay, he's not mocking the reporter's disability. This is just a generally mocking posture that he takes towards people that he thinks are incompetent. Is that a better story? It's a different story. Actually, we're going to go back. Let's go back to if you made some notes about those logical fallacies. Look at the last two lines here, because we see two logical fallacies right in these two lines here. Green, the reporter, the NPR reporter, says, this is so interesting. It's two different realities. To people who criticized the president, it was pretty clear that he was mocking him. Okay, that's one of our logical fallacies right there. That's a hasty generalization, right? To people who criticized the president, it was pretty clear that he was mocking him. Well, I mean, have we talked about all of them and who they were and what they fall into? So this reporter immediately leaps into a hasty generalization about this event, and then his interviewee responds with another logical fallacy. Why is that so offensive to you? Why are you so morally outraged for someone else? We just saw this one too, right? This is substituting a question for a statement. Now we're not talking anymore, okay? The reporter missed it first. The interviewee is just responding. We are straight into fake news now because neither one of them is actually dealing with the story about what happened. We move on here. Now, this is even, so, you know, that we've talked a little bit about what we would say to this fake news in terms of rhetoric. Is there another story that could be told? Yes. We've already seen just a couple, and I'll try to wrap up with this. We've already seen a couple of logical fallacies, logic stage problems with how the interviewee and the interviewer are relating to each other. Now let's go all the way back to that first question, to that grammar stage question of who is the hero of this story. Immediately, another interviewee jumps in, her name's Kathy Bemistarfer, and says, they called us deplorables. And now it's just the voters talking between themselves. They called, yes, Yeah, Hillary. And they don't care because we're just bigots. We're bigots. We're racists. We're racist because we might not agree. They call us terrible names. Absolutely. We are judged. Moving on. And this is the end of the interview. And then someone else jumps in. Right now, I don't feel as though I'm judged. I know I'm judged. My family is judged. The people of Iowa are judged. And if you're a Christian, you're really judged. And if you're white, you're judged. That was the end of the interview. This started off, okay, with Trump, whether or not Trump mocked a disabled reporter, and this is where we ended up. So this is why it's so important to understand the basic construct of history and the way that it relates to news, all right? At this point, this story, the reporter thinks this story is about Trump. The reporter is acting on the assumption that we're talking about Trump. Are we talking about Trump? That's not the hero of this story. That's not the hero of this historical narrative. The conflict that this hero faces has nothing to do with Trump. The struggle has nothing to do with Trump. The possible climax actually has very little to do with Trump. If we can train is this making sense to you guys? Okay, so if we can train ourselves to read about the past intelligently, to think about who the hero is, what's the conflict, what possible logical fallacies arrive when we look at how the story is related to the facts? Are there, and then moving on to the rhetoric stage, are there alternative stories that we can tell about this? We are training ourselves to be able to look at very recent history, and that's what we're talking about when we start talking about fake news, and take that same attitude towards it. If this reporter had been capable of realizing that we weren't talking about Trump anymore, this could have been a really effective, interesting conversation, and instead of going like this, maybe, possibly, these two sets of people would have gone like this. Go back, finish up here with John Arnold again. History is above all else an argument. It is an argument between different historians, and arguments are important. They create the possibility of changing things. Nothing is going to change until we are able to think about these stories about where people are, what they fear, what they hope for, what they hope their lives will be like, and be able to dig down beneath the surface of true and fake, accurate, inaccurate, beneath those words, and really start to understand how people view the world. That's what the bigger task of the historian is. You may start off practicing it with ancient history or medieval history or early 20th century history, but ultimately what we're going to hope is that those skills of understanding are going to spread out into our current political climate, because I think that's the only way to get us out of the mess that we're currently in. So this is history in the age of fake news.